Welcome back, everybody, to another deep dive. We are going to be tackling wrongful convictions in the U.S. justice system today.
Wow, big topic.
It is. And, you've sent us so many fascinating sources, and we're going to try and untangle this web. It's not just about shocking stories, right? We're looking for patterns, looking for those cracks in the system.
The things that make you kind of like rethink what justice means, right?
Exactly. So to give you just the taste of what we're diving into today, we've got a detective who was framing people who were dealing drugs. We've got so-called experts who are using bite marks to send people to death row.
Death row, wow.
It's heavy stuff. And a pathologist who has been nicknamed the Cadaver King. He's performed a crazy amount of autopsies, like thousands and thousands. So buckle up, everybody. This is going to be a ride.
Yeah. Something I think is really important to remember as we're looking through all this stuff is that these aren't just case files. These are real people.
Real people.
And their lives are being completely upended by these wrongful convictions.
Yeah. All right. So let's start with the Norfolk Four. This case begins with a woman named Michelle Bosco, who was murdered in Virginia in 1997. Right away, suspicion fell on some U.S. sailors, and that's where things started to get really messy.
It's interesting how quickly the focus went right to those sailors, even though there wasn't physical evidence.
It's almost like they had their minds made up from the beginning, right? Like they were looking for someone to blame.
Yeah.
And then enters a detective named Glenn Ford. This guy is like a pivotal character in this story. His interrogation tactics were super shady. I mean, we're talking coerced confessions. This guy was preying on the sailors' fears, using like classic good cop, bad cop manipulation. And here's the thing. One of those sailors, Joe Dick, he later said that he confessed just to stop the interrogation. He thought that the DNA evidence was going to clear his name.
Wow, that's a huge gamble. Talk about, faith in the system.
It's a huge gamble.
That the system is going to work.
Yeah.
And that the DNA evidence is going to, come back and clear his name.
Yeah. Yeah. And this whole thing, it makes you think about how common are these kinds of tactics in wrongful convictions. I mean, this idea of forcing someone to confess, it's a nightmare.
It is. And it makes you wonder how many innocent people have actually, admitted to crimes that they didn't commit.
Yeah. I mean, it's terrifying to think about, but in this case, the DNA evidence actually did what it was supposed to do.
That's good.
So it excluded all 7 sailors that were involved, and even more importantly, they found the real killer, Omar Ballard. His DNA was a match to the crime scene. And get this, Ballard actually had a history of violence against women.
Oh, wow.
But the police completely missed it. Why? Because they were so focused on the sailors.
That tunnel vision. It's just like textbook tunnel vision.
Yeah. Focusing on the wrong people, let the actual guilty person just walk free.
And hurt more people.
Yeah. So the Norfolk Four, they spent years in prison. 3 of them got conditional pardons from the governor. But here's the thing about conditional pardons, right? It means you're released, but you're still considered a felon.
So they carry that with them.
Imagine trying to put your life back together with that hanging over you.
It's like a shadow.
Yeah.
It's a shadow of injustice. It just follows them around.
It really is. Okay. So here's a little plot twist. Detective Glenn Ford, the guy who coerced those confessions, well, years later he got convicted. Not for framing innocent men, but for extortion.
Oh, wow. What?
I know, right? It's just crazy. Makes you wonder what else he might have gotten away with.
Right. Like if someone is willing to abuse their power for money, what else are they capable of?
Yeah, it's scary. Okay, so we just talked about a case where DNA evidence eventually set things right. Now, we're going to a case where the main drivers were prejudice and straight-up manipulation of the system. We're going to Conroe, Texas. Back in 1980, this is the story of Clarence Branley, a janitor at a high school. He was accused of murdering a white high school student. And this case is like a huge example of how racial bias can just totally warp justice.
It's a really clear example of how prejudice can just poison the whole system.
Yeah. So, picture this. Conroe, Texas, back in 1980.
Okay.
Lots of racial tension, lots of division. Being a black man in Conroe back then basically made you an automatic suspect for a lot of people.
Oh, yeah. Just guilty by association, guilty because of who you are.
Guilty just because of who you are. And the prosecution in this case was just awful. They were hiding evidence, key pieces of evidence, poof, vanished. And there were even rumors that the judge and the prosecutor were working together in secret.
So they were colluding, basically.
Basically.
Working together to make sure that he got convicted.
Yeah. It's like a total nightmare. So in this whole mess, one juror actually stood out. His name was Bill Srack. He was a white man. and he refused to convict Clarence Brantley. He knew he was innocent, and he didn't care about the pressure. He even got called awful names for standing up for what he believed. Talk about courage. Right?
That's huge.
Yeah.
That's real courage to stand up to that kind of pressure. Like, imagine everyone's against you. Everyone is telling you you're wrong.
Yeah.
And you know you're right.
Yeah, you're the one guy on the jury who's like, wait a minute, this doesn't feel right. And Bill Shrek, he paid a price for his integrity. He got harassed, threatened. People wouldn't give him jobs because of his stance in the Brantley case. But he believed in Clarence's innocence, and ultimately that belief helped pave the way for Clarence's freedom. It took years of legal battles, some new suspects emerged, and finally, Clarence Brantley's conviction was overturned.
10 years. A decade of his life was just like stolen.
Stolen.
It's just an awful illustration of how slowly the justice system can move, especially when you're up against like systemic racism.
Yeah. It's not a system that's designed to help everyone equally, right?
Right.
Okay. So we've talked about coerced confessions. We've talked about racial bias. Now let's get into something a little different. We're going to talk about junk science.
Oh, yeah, that's a good one.
It's crazy how something that's presented as science can have so much power in a courtroom.
It's like a magic trick, right?
Yeah.
It's dressed up as science.
Yeah. So let me introduce you to Dr. Stephen Hain, a.k.a. the Cadaver King. This pathologist worked in Mississippi, and he was just churning out autopsies, like an unbelievable number of autopsies. I'm talking thousands a year, sometimes even 1,500 during his peak.
Well, wait. Thousands?
Thousands.
In 1 year?
1 year.
How is that even possible?
Right. It makes you question, like, how good could these autopsies really be?
I mean, how can anyone do that many autopsies and do them well?
Yeah, exactly. He was like a one-man autopsy machine, working 7 days a week, no vacations. It was like the Wild West of autopsies. And oversight. Forget about it.
So no one was really checking his work.
Nope. And this is where things get really messed up. Two men, Levon Brooks and Kennedy Brewer, their lives got tangled up with Dr. Hain and his methods. They were both convicted of murder based on bite mark evidence.
Bite marks.
Bite marks. Seriously. And this evidence was provided by Dr. Hain and his buddy, Dr. Michael West. And let me tell you, bite mark analysis, it's been totally debunked. It's not real science. It's subjective. It's not accurate. And it's led to a ton of wrongful convictions.
Oh, I bet.
And get this. Dr. West, Hain's friend, he came up with this technique called direct comparison. He would take the suspect's dental mold and literally press it onto the victim's skin.
What?
I know, right? It's insane. And he called this science. He basically created the bite marks he was then using as evidence.
It's like he's trying to make the evidence fit his story instead of the other way around.
Exactly. It's confirmation bias at its worst. And it wasn't just a one-time thing. They used this technique over and over again. So who knows how many innocent people ended up in prison because of it.
It makes you wonder how much of his other work was flawed, too.
Right. Like, how much of it can we even trust? And these guys, Hain and West, they have a whole highlight reel of bad forensic science. There's the Tony Kiko case. Hain claimed he could tell how a victim was shot just by looking at the bullet's path.
Oh, my gosh.
Even though he wasn't a ballistics expert at all. Thankfully, the charges were dropped when real experts came in and said, nope, this is bogus.
And thank goodness for real experts.
Right. And then there's the bologna sandwich case. They tried to match bite marks on a half-eaten bologna sandwich to a suspect.
A bologna sandwich.
I'm not kidding, totally ignoring the fact that the victim had eaten the other half of the sandwich.
It sounds ridiculous.
It does, right. But this is real life, and it had real consequences for the people involved.
Yeah.
It just shows you how easy it is for junk science to sneak its way into the courtroom.
It's scary to think about how many people might be in prison based on these, like, bogus methods.
Yeah. I think we need a break from all these autopsies and bite marks.
Maybe we should skip lunch today, huh?
Yeah, probably.
No bologna sandwiches for us.
All right. So we've talked about coerced confessions, racial bias, junk science. Now let's move on to a case where DNA evidence was basically just ignored.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah. This is the Chester 4. It's a case that'll make you wonder how far some prosecutors will go to get a conviction.
It's sad. Like, even with proof, they just won't admit they were wrong.
So this case is about Henrietta Nickens, an older woman who was murdered in Pennsylvania in 1997. 4 young black men, Sam Grasty, Derek Chappell, Morton Johnson, and Rick McElwee, were arrested. The evidence against them was shaky from the beginning.
So we're talking coerced confessions again, right?
Yep, you guessed it. Rick McElwee, the youngest of the group, he confessed. But his story kept changing, almost like he was being told what to say.
Like he was being coached or something.
Exactly. And the prosecution's story was just wild. They claimed these four guys went in and out of the apartment multiple times, but McGalloway initially said he was the lookout and never mentioned that. They even threw in this mysterious, unknown male #1 character who just popped up whenever their story needed him.
It sounds like a bad movie.
It does, right. Like they were making it up as they went along. But here's where it gets truly crazy. DNA evidence from the crime scene excluded all four suspects. All four.
Wait a second, but isn't DNA evidence supposed to be like the gold standard?
It is. You'd think that would be the end of the story, right?
Yeah, case closed.
Nope. The prosecution actually argued that the DNA evidence was irrelevant. They downplayed the possibility of sexual assault, even though there was, evidence of that.
Oh, come on. That's messed up. Ignoring DNA evidence just to get a conviction. That's just wrong.
It really is. And the Judge Wright, he believed McElway's ever-changing story. It's like nobody wanted to admit they were wrong, even when the evidence was right there in front of them.
It's like they were blinded by their own need to win. It's a shame, really.
And the fight to clear their names continues to this day. The Chester Four, they spent years in prison for a crime they didn't commit, and they're still waiting for justice.
It just makes you wonder, how many other cases are out there like this?
Right. It's a reminder that we can't just trust the system blindly.
Yeah. We need to keep asking questions, keep pushing for the truth.
Absolutely. Okay, ready for another case?
Bring it on. Let's keep going.
Okay. From Pennsylvania, we're heading back down to Texas. Another story about a life derailed by a bad investigation and unreliable evidence. This time, it's Joe Bryan, a well-loved school principal. Imagine going from a respected member of your community to being accused of killing your wife.
Oh, that's a nightmare scenario.
It is. So Joe Bryan's wife, Mickey, she was murdered in their home. The investigation was a disaster from the get-go. They had no physical evidence linking Joe to the crime. So what do? They start spreading rumors, trying to make him look bad. They even tried to say that he was secretly gay, hoping that would give them some kind of motive.
Wow, playing on people's prejudices is so unfair.
It is. It's just a smear campaign.
It's a classic character assassination, isn't it?
It is. And remember Dr. Hain, our favorite pathologist.
Oh no, not him again.
He's back. But this time, it's not about an autopsy. It's about a blood spatter analysis. There was this so-called expert, Robert Thorman, and he claimed that tiny specks on a flashlight in Joe's car trunk were Mickey's blood. And he said the blood spatter patterns proved Joe was the killer.
So again, relying on questionable forensic evidence, it's becoming a theme here.
It is. And you know what? Thorman later admitted he was wrong.
Wait, seriously? He recanted his testimony?
He did. He said his methods were wrong, his conclusions about the flashlight were wrong, and they even did further testing. And it turns out those specks might not even have been blood at all.
So the whole thing was based on a lie, basically.
Basically. And you know what's even worse? The police completely ignored a possible suspect named Dennis Dunlap. This guy was a police officer with a shady past.
So they ignored a potentially guilty cop to focus on the grieving husband.
It's crazy, right? It's like they had their minds made up. Thankfully, Joe Bryan was finally released in 2021 because of health problems, after spending decades in prison for something he probably didn't do.
Decades.
Decades.
It's mind-boggling.
It really is. It's a reminder that we need to question everything. Question the evidence, question the experts, and definitely question the motives of the people in charge of the investigation. All right. Let's shift gears again. This time, we're going to Louisiana. This is a case that's all about coerced confessions and hidden evidence.
Lead the way. I'm ready.
Okay. This is the story of the Hasty Mart 6. It really shines a light on racial bias and how far some prosecutors will go to win a case.
Oh, this doesn't sound good.
So in 1976, a convenience store owner named Louis Gladue was killed during a robbery in Louisiana. 6 black men, David Alexander, Harry Granger, John Collins, Ronald Miller, Herbert Daroon, and Renee Jackson were arrested and convicted. And the whole case was just full of the usual problems. Coerced confessions, a really unreliable eyewitness, and a prosecutor who seemed more interested in winning than finding the truth.
So basically a recipe for disaster.
Pretty much. The prosecution's main witness was a woman named Mary Arsenault. She admitted to being high on drugs when the robbery happened, and her story kept changing. At one point, she even identified a guy who wasn't even in the state at the time. But the prosecution just ignored all of that and presented her as a reliable witness.
They just ignored those inconsistencies. Seriously.
Yep. It's like they didn't care about the truth, they just wanted to win. And get this, the prosecutor, Dracos Burke, He offered immunity deals to Ronald Miller and John Collins if they testified against the others. Think about it. They're facing a lifetime in Angola prison, a notoriously tough prison.
Wow.
But they chose to maintain their innocence. They wouldn't lie even to save themselves.
That's amazing. Talk about integrity.
It is. It's incredibly brave. And years later, a man named Malcolm Roy, he confessed to the crime. And guess what? The convictions of the Hasty Mart 6 were finally overturned. Turns out, Roy was involved in other robberies with the actual perpetrators, but their names never even came up in the original investigation.
Oh my gosh. So they had the wrong guys the entire time.
The entire time.
It just blows my mind how this can happen. It's a testament to their strength, holding on to their innocence, even when facing those kinds of pressures.
Absolutely. And it shows that sometimes the truth does come out, even if it takes years.
It gives me hope, that even when the system fails, the truth can still prevail.
Yeah, me too. Okay, let's move from Louisiana back to Texas for our next case. This one's about resilience and fighting for justice. It's the story of Carrie Max Cook.
Another Texas case.
I
Wow.
know, right? Texas has had its share of these kinds of cases, but this one's pretty intense. So back in 1977, Carrie Max Cook was a young guy living in Texas, and he was convicted of a brutal murder. This case has everything. A biased investigation, hidden evidence, junk science, even mistaken identity. It's a perfect storm of injustice.
It's scary to think about how easily an innocent person can get caught up in a system like that, especially when you factor in all the prejudices and biases that exist.
It's terrifying. So the police in this case were so focused on pinning the crime on Carrie that they totally ignored the real killer, James Mayfield, a guy who was actually connected to the victim. They wanted Carrie to be guilty so badly that they even started painting him in the media as some kind of sexual deviant.
But come on, using someone's sexuality against them like that is so low.
It is. It's a classic tactic, unfortunately, but it's just wrong. And to make things even worse, they brought in this guy, Dr. James Grisham, who was known in Texas as Dr. Death. This guy was notorious for helping send people to death row based on, the flimsiest of evidence. He never even met Carrie, but he testified that he was a sociopath who would definitely kill again.
That's awful. Testifying against someone without even meeting them. How is that allowed?
It's a whole other story, but this Dr. Grisham, he had a reputation. And his testimony, even though it was questionable at best, it held a lot of weight. Now, Carrie's time in prison was a nightmare. Sexual abuse, suicide attempts. He lived with the threat of execution hanging over him for years. But even through all that, he never gave up hope. He fought back, studied law, and eventually, DNA evidence cleared his name. But the fight wasn't over. Even after the DNA results came back, the district attorney still insisted that Carrie was guilty.
Well, they just wouldn't let it go.
It's unbelievable, right? It just goes to show how strong those biases can be.
Yeah, and how determined some people are to be right, even when they're clearly wrong.
Exactly. After decades of fighting, Carrie was finally granted a new trial, and he ended up taking a plea deal that allowed him to walk free. But he's still fighting to clear his name completely.
He deserves that.
He does. His story is just incredible. It reminds us that even when things seem hopeless, there's always hope.
And it shows how important it is to keep fighting for justice, even when the system seems rigged against you.
Okay. We've explored cases with coerced confessions, racial bias, junk science, and just plain stubbornness from those in power. Now, let's talk about a case that really makes you think about the death penalty. This is the story of Todd Willingham, a man who was executed in Texas for a crime he probably didn't commit.
This is one of those cases that just keeps you up at night.
It is. So, Todd Willingham was accused of setting a fire that killed his 3 young daughters in 1991. 2 arson investigators, Manuel Vasquez and Douglas Fogg, they determined the fire was arson, but they were using outdated methods that have since been proven wrong.
So they were using bad science to make a life or death decision.
Basically. Back then, they thought things like cracked glass or certain burn patterns always meant arson, but now we know those things can happen in accidental fires, too. A renowned fire scientist, Dr. Gerald Hurst, he looked at the evidence years later and said the fire was probably an accident. But by then, it was too late for Todd Willingham.
This is heartbreaking. Just thinking about the fact that he might have been innocent and there was nothing he could do.
It is. And the prosecution's case was weak. They leaned heavily on that flawed arson investigation and the testimony of a jailhouse informant named Johnny Webb. This guy claimed that Todd confessed to him, but later it came out that Webb had lied to get a shorter sentence.
So they put a man to death based on the word of a liar.
It's horrifying. Despite all the evidence that pointed towards Todd's innocence, the Texas authorities went ahead with the execution.
This case really forces us to question the death penalty. Can we really trust a system that has the power to take a life, especially when there's even a shadow of a doubt about guilt?
It's a huge question, right? And Todd Willingham, he maintained his innocence until the very end. He was executed in 2004.
This is a story that should make everyone stop and think. It's a stark reminder of the flaws in our system and the very real possibility that innocent people are being put to death.
It's a sobering thought. As we've gone through these cases, we've seen characters emerge. We've seen systemic flaws, moments of courage and moments of despair. We've seen how easy it is for the pursuit of justice to get derailed by prejudice, ambition, and just plain resistance to the truth. But we've also seen resilience, the unwavering fight for exoneration, and a push for a fairer system.
We need to learn from these cases, to identify those patterns, and to figure out how to prevent these kinds of injustices from happening in the future. These aren't just isolated incidents. They're symptoms of a system that needs to be fixed.
You're right. They're a call to action for all of us.
It's amazing, right? Like when you start digging into these cases, you see these patterns emerge, and it's almost like a roadmap of like how things go wrong.
It really is. It's unsettling how many similarities there are between these cases, even though they happened in different states, different decades.
Yeah. It's like we're making the same mistakes over and over again.
Exactly. And one of the biggest ones it shows is coerced confessions.
Right. We've seen how easily people, especially when they're vulnerable, can be pressured into saying they did something, even if they didn't.
It's like that whole good cop, bad cop routine. It can really mess with someone's head.
Especially if you're young, scared, or just like don't understand the legal system.
Yeah. They're going up against these like seasoned detectives who are trained to get confessions.
And sometimes it feels like they don't really care if the confession is true or not.
It's all about closing the case, right? Getting that conviction. And that pressure, it can lead to some seriously messed up outcomes.
Right. Like in the Norfolk 4 case, you had Joe Dick confessing just to make the interrogation stop. And then in the Chester 4, Rick McKelwey's story kept changing. Like it felt like he was being told what to say.
It's scary to think about, honestly. How much pressure does it take to make someone admit to something they didn't do?
It's a psychological thing, you know? Like, imagine being interrogated for hours on end. You might start to doubt yourself.
Absolutely. And it's not just about the individual cases. It's about a system that allows this to happen. A system that sometimes values a confession over the truth.
And another pattern we see, and this one's a big one, is tunnel vision.
Tunnel vision.
Yeah, like when investigators get fixated on one suspect and they just ignore any evidence that doesn't fit their theory.
Oh, yeah. Like they've got blinders on.
Exactly. They become so focused on proving their case that they miss the bigger picture.
It's like in that Hasty Mart 6 case. That eyewitness, Mary Arsenault, her story kept changing, but the prosecution just ignored it. They were so convinced that those 6 men were guilty that they didn't even consider other possibilities.
It's like once they've made up their mind, nothing can change it.
Yeah. It's like they stopped being objective. It's not about finding the truth anymore. It's about winning. And that can have some really serious consequences.
Right. Innocent people go to prison while the real perpetrators might still be out there.
It's a huge problem. And it's not just investigators who do this. We've seen prosecutors do the same thing, refusing to acknowledge evidence that could prove someone innocent.
Like in the Carrie Max Cook case, even with DNA evidence pointing to someone else, the district attorney still insisted that Carrie was guilty.
Yeah, it's like their ego gets in the way. It's crazy.
It's like they're more concerned with protecting their reputation than with doing what's right.
It's really sad. And it's not just about individual prosecutors or investigators. It's about a culture that allows this to happen, a culture that rewards winning at all costs.
We need to change that culture. We need to prioritize truth and fairness above all else.
Okay, so we've got coerced confessions, tunnel vision. Now let's talk about junk science. It's amazing how much weight so-called experts can have in a courtroom, even when their methods are totally bogus.
Right. It's like people hear expert and they just automatically believe everything they say.
It's like they're wearing a lab coat, so they must be right. Right.
Exactly. But the reality is a lot of what's presented as science in courtrooms is actually really shaky.
And it can have a huge impact on people's lives. Just think about those 2 guys in Mississippi, Levon Brooks and Kennedy Brewer. They were convicted based on bite mark evidence. Bite marks.
Seriously. I thought they'd stopped using that stuff years ago.
Well, apparently not. It's been completely debunked, but it's still being used in some cases. And that's just one example. We've also seen problems with arson investigations, hair analysis, blood spatter analysis. It's a real problem.
Yeah. I think part of the problem is that juries don't always understand the science.
Yeah.
So they just have to trust what the experts are telling them.
That's a good point. We need to do a better job of educating juries about these issues, making sure they understand that just because someone calls themselves an expert doesn't mean they're always right.
And we need to hold these experts accountable. If they're using flawed methods, if they're giving misleading testimony, there need to be consequences.
Absolutely. And we can't forget about racial bias. It's a thread that runs through so many of these cases.
Yeah. We see it in the Clarence Branley case, the Hasty Mart 6 case. It's like a dark cloud hanging over the whole system.
It's so pervasive, and it affects everything, from who gets investigated to who gets charged to who gets convicted. It's a huge problem.
And it's not always overt racism, you know? It can be subtle, unconscious biases that people don't even realize they have.
That's what makes it so hard to fight, right? It's baked into the system.
We need to start by acknowledging that this is a problem, and then we need to start dismantling the structures that allow racism to persist.
It's a long road, but it's a road we have to travel.
We owe it to ourselves, and we owe it to all the people who have been unjustly harmed by the system.
Okay, so we've talked about coerced confessions, tunnel vision, junk science, and racial bias. These are all major problems that need to be addressed. But where do we go from here? What do we do with this information? How do we make things better?
That's the big question, isn't it? I mean, these cases, they're heartbreaking. They show us just how flawed our justice system can be, but they also show us the human cost of those flaws. These are real people, real lives that have been shattered by injustice. And it's up to all of us to make sure it doesn't keep happening.
Man, we have really gone deep on some tough cases. It's heavy stuff, you know?
It is. And it makes you think, like, if these are the cases we know about, how many more are out there? How many people are stuck in prison right now for crimes they didn't commit?
It's a scary thought, but it's also a call to action, right? We can't just sit here and be sad about it. We have to do something.
Absolutely. Awareness is important, but it's not enough. We need to turn that awareness into action.
So where do we even start?
Well, there are organizations out there that are doing amazing work to help people who have been wrongly convicted. The Innocence Project, Centurion Ministries, these groups are using DNA evidence, legal expertise. They're fighting hard to get innocent people out of prison and to fix the system.
Those organizations, they're lifesavers. Literally.
They are. And they need our support. We can donate, volunteer, spread the word about the work they do.
Yeah. And it's not just about supporting those organizations. We need to be informed voters, pay attention to the candidates, the policies that affect our justice system.
Exactly. We need to elect people who are committed to reform, who actually care about justice.
Yeah.
And we need to hold them accountable once they're in office.
That means doing our research, asking tough questions. We can't just assume things will change on their own.
Right. And we can't underestimate the power of our own voices. We need to talk about these issues with our friends, our families, our communities.
Share these stories, right? Make sure people know what's happening.
Exactly. And challenge the narratives that perpetuate stereotypes and biases. Speak up when you see injustice. Don't be silent.
It's about using whatever platform we have, even if it's just our social media or talking to our neighbors, to amplify the voices of those who have been silenced.
We all have a role to play in creating a more just and equitable world. It starts with recognizing the problems, understanding how those problems affect real people, and then committing to making things better.
It's a constant process, right? A journey that doesn't really end.
It does.
Yeah.
But every step we take towards justice is a step in the right direction.
That's a good way to put it. Well, thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. We know it was a heavy one, but we hope you found it informative and maybe even inspiring.
We hope it motivates you to get involved, to do something, to make a difference, because even one voice can make a difference.
Absolutely. Keep questioning, keep learning, keep pushing for a better world. We'll see you next time on The Deep Dive.